Welcome to a world where participants in psychology experiments respond to pictures they haven't seen yet. Where dreamers and writers literally remember their future. A world where we are caught in time loops. Self-fulfilling prophecies where effects become their very causes. Time to explore our present and future realities here on Things Visible and Invisible. Eric, the last time we spoke, you gave a very convincing case for time travel, its theoretical possibilities and its practical application. Today we're talking about precognition. That's one of the ideas in your book, Time Loops. What exactly is precognition?
Yeah, great question. Precognition is a purported ESP ability to see or know or be influenced by future events or experiences. And it's very controversial. Mainstream psychology doesn't accept that such a thing exists. On the other hand, every culture throughout history has accepted the reality of something like precognition. They would use different terms, but the phenomenon of having dreams that relate to future events is extremely common. It's probably the most common so-called paranormal experience that people report, even in our culture. And every single culture throughout history has accepted that some dreams foretell the future, and that we can get glimpses of the future in meditation or in altered states or what have you. So it's very interesting because it defies all of our understandings of how causality works. You know, we think of time as moving in a single direction and causes moving in a single direction. And precognition totally defies that. And that's why there is such skepticism around it. Physicists, since the Enlightenment, have sort of insisted that there's a one-way linear arrow of time, and that causes traveling back from the future, which used to be called teleology, are just forbidden. You can't imagine such a thing. Back in the Enlightenment, they thought that teleology, the only way they could imagine teleology was that it was somehow God's divine plan. And the rule in science was you don't let your equations can't include God. They can't include miracles. So they kind of got rid of this idea that there could be causes in the world that travel backwards from the future. And with that, the idea of dreams, about something happening tomorrow or a disaster happening next week, got just thrown out of mainstream science. Yet people experience these things all the time. They're incredibly common. And in fact, the field of parapsychology has many experiments have been done over decades, several decades, that firmly establish the reality of precognition. How it works. We still don't know how it works, but it's a real thing. I mean, I'll go out on a limb and say quite firmly that it's a real thing, and it needs to be studied. And I think eventually it will be studied. I think eventually all the skepticism will break down.
Okay, before we get into some of the experiments, and I'm very interested, your book talks about this, but when did it re-enter the kind of intellectual realm? I mean, if the Enlightenment kind of ruled it out, and it was ruled out from a science perspective, presumably philosophically it was still being discussed to some extent, but when would you sort of say that it started to re-enter the consciousness in terms of the intellectual debate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say around the turn of the 20th century. In the sort of in the Victorian era, in the 1880s specifically, the first so-called psychical researchers, these were sort of the precursors of what we now call parapsychologists, were documenting case after case of paranormal phenomena, including dreams about future events, and starting to try and understand these things and try to sort of counter the sort of mainstream scientific headwinds saying, no, 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 these things can't exist. And one of the early researchers was named Frederick Myers. He was a classicist and a psychologist, and he was a co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research. And he theorized these kinds of phenomena under the rubric of telepathy. Telepathy. He was the inventor of that term telepathy, and for him, it sort of meant this kind of subconscious connection to other people and to the world. And it sort of encompassed these dreams that people would have about future events and so on. It was sort of a vague term, and it was based very much on the metaphor of the telegraph, which at that time was linking people across great distances. And it provided this handy metaphor for people knowing things that they can't seemingly possibly know. Um, so, but the concept of precognition really didn't come into it until I would say the 1930s, or maybe earlier, 1920s, 1930s, um, when experimenters would do experiments with card guessing, where they'd have one person try to guess what was on a card being held by another person, and they would assume that they were testing telepathy, but they would notice that sometimes the card guesser would be always wrong, but they would be always right about the next card being picked. And so gradually, this notion of precognition, well, maybe there's a way in which people are somehow detecting the future. And so precognition sort of entered in as part of this rubric that J.B. Rhine called extrasensory perception, or ESP. And this was in the 1930s. He had a lab at Duke University in the United States, and he coined that term ESP that we're now very familiar with. And one type of ESP was precognition, but people still didn't really believe it. It was easy to kind of understand how maybe there could be electromagnetic waves we're not aware of that connect us to other people and account for sort of telepathic like experiences. But the idea of precognition still was very like, how can that work? So it's always been kind of, ESP itself has been very marginalized, and mainstream psychologists have like rejected the existence of ESP, but if they especially reject the existence of precognition. Nevertheless, there's growing evidence, and in fact, physicists are now accepting that there's kind of an underlying physics that could allow something like precognitive experiences.
It's fascinating, Eric. You're discussing there the origins of this and the way in which it moves from psychical research into a sort of more scientific basis. Was it part of that sort of late 19th century, early 20th century moment when other religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, started to enter the Western mindset, and the sort of nascent New Age movement started? I mean, I say that because is there a way in which what you're trying to do, which is looking at it through a scientific lens, do you think it's been slightly colored by that origin story to the point where people are dismissing it and putting it with some of the more fringe elements that came in around that same time?
That's an interesting question. I I think in a way not, because in a way I think those mystical and religious movements of the early 20th century, especially theosophy, um, and spiritualism and so on, they didn't really talk about precognition as parapsychologists understand it. I mean, they too uh, talked in more nebulous terms around connection to the universe and so on. But I think it was really with the help of advances uh, in mainstream physics, like Einstein, honestly, who sort of told us, as we talked about in our other interview, that actually, well, it's not so simple. Time isn't as simple as we think it is, and there is that possibility of going backwards in time, and that sort of opened the possibility for messages to be transmitted backward in time, and that's what or signals to travel backwards in time. And that's kind of what precognition seems like. It's some sort of information from the future reaching us in the present. So I would say that it was actually the sciences really in the early 20th century and quantum physics too that kind of made precognition as we talk about it now, sort of scientifically, possible to think about in distinction from like telepathy or clairvoyance or these other kind of modalities.
So, if that is the case, Eric, why do you think there's still largely either ignorance or resistance even to the whole idea of precognition within the academy at this time?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. The academy is very conservative. Academics are fearful of their jobs. um, and the sciences are often very conservative. Psychology is the field that really should be studying precognition or at ESP in general. And psychology has a funny history where it's always struggled to legitimize itself. In the mid 20th century, it was, uh, they were not taken seriously by hard scientists, so-called hard scientists, biologists and physicists and so on. And so psychologists really struggled to make their field seem like a real science on par with those hard sciences. And so there's always been an anxiety, a deep anxiety in the field of psychology to not uh, go into these realms of woo, you know. And so parapsychology has always been pushed aside and rejected. And you'll find that, in fact, many parapsychologists, I don't know if it's most, but many parapsychologists have actually come from other fields. Like J.B. Rhine himself was a botanist. Uh, a number of prominent parapsychologists that worked in the sort of second half of the 20th century came from physics or engineering backgrounds. So that, there's actually a lot more openness to this idea in other fields, but the field that officially studies the mind does not like it. And I'll also say the field that officially studies the mind scientifically does not like it. Clinical psychologists don't often have as much of a problem with this idea. I mean, you'll find a range of viewpoints on ESP and precognition in clinical psychology writers, and a number of psychoanalysts over the years have been, very open to the possible reality of these phenomena. But scientific psychologists, no, they relegate parapsychology to a chapter in the back of their textbook, on pseudoscience, and they have a joke that ESP stands for error someplace.
That's fascinating, Eric. But I mean, and I'm just wondering though about people who come into this field and study it, and you've said they come from many different disciplines. Is there sometimes a kind of personal spark of some sort of encounter with this idea on a personal level that sort of opens the mind to somebody to enter into this realm?
Sometimes, absolutely. I mean, that's true of anything. You have a personal encounter with something, and that leads you to want to study that thing. Whether it's a personal encounter with a certain illness that leads you to medicine or whatever. And surely that's the case. Again, many people, if not most people, experience what we would call ESP experiences at some point in their lives. And most people just sort of sweep it under their mental rug because we don't have as a culture, we still don't have a concept that can kind of, or a bucket that we can put those experiences in and say, oh, this is a valid experience. And we have, skeptical people like dismissing it or making you feel like you're crazy. So people tend to not talk about them. But yeah, to some extent, some people who go into studying this have had personal experiences, but it's also true that some of the most prominent people who've studied this have not had these experiences themselves and have struggled with their own skepticism. In fact, when they see the data that shows these things existing, and they struggle to reconcile it with their own beliefs, their own pre-existing beliefs. I can think of a number of parapsychologists that had no prior belief in or interest in paranormal phenomena of any kind, and yet the data were showing them plainly that ESP exists.
Fascinating. Well, unfortunately, Eric, we've come to the end of this segment. Tell people where they can find out more about you and pick up a copy of Time Loops.
Yeah, they can find information about me on my website, ericwargo.com, all one word. My books are on sale at Amazon and other online retailers. And I have a blog called The Nightshirt.
For now, Eric, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.